Welcome back to Linux TV, the only YouTube channel in Kenya that teaches you how to use Linux systems and cyber security. So in today's video, we are going to continue with our Linux basics for hackers course. And last time we finished looking at the basic commands that you can use in Linux. Today we are going to look at basic user and group management and file ownership and permissions. And these are very crucial topic. And today I don't think we are going to run any commands, but we are just going to build the foundations on how you can manage users, groups, and these file ownership and permissions in Linux. And on building the foundation, we are going to talk about three things at most. One, we are going to talk about the user types, that is the types of users in Linux. Two, we are going to talk about user identifiers, group identifiers, and we are also going to talk about the files used to store information and configurations for these users and groups available in your system. And lastly, we are going to talk about how you can view and interpret these file ownerships and permissions in Linux. So in Linux, everything is treated as a file. That is, when we talk of everything, we are talking about your keyboard, your mouse, your screen, even your webcam is treated as a file. Apart from the other ordinary files, like the text files, PDFs, Word document files. So that is how the Linux kernel is able to work with these devices, by treating them as files. And in Linux also, when you create a file or any file that exists in a Linux system, must have an owner and a group. And when you say about an owner and a group, is when you create a file, you become the owner. And on the Linux system, you must be, or you are probably, or you belong to either a certain group in that system. So that's how the file has ownership, or ownership can be attributed to either an owner or a group. And the owner has the full permissions on that file. He can dictate who can read the file, who can modify the file, and who can delete the file, and so on. And the other users, maybe who belong to the same group as the owner of the file, also become group owners of that file. And the owner of that file gives the users in that group the permissions he wants. And that's how file permissions can be attributed to these users and groups in a Linux system. And another thing I forgot to say is that in Linux we have three types of users. One is we have the system users or service users, and these are users who can run non-interactive programs or services in the Linux system. Non-interactive programs, these are programs that run in the background. For example, a web server is a good example of non-interactive programs, because it does not require you to interact with it all the time. You just configure it run it and just leave it there. So those are the type of, that is one type of user we have, system users, and they have certain restricted permissions in Linux. Another type of user we have is the regular users. Regular users are users who are just used to log in into the system and run interactive programs, simple interactive programs. Simple interactive programs, for example, is let's say a word processor like Microsoft Word, but in Linux we don't have Microsoft Word. We use LibreOffice. So that is a good example of an interactive program, a program that you can interact with at most times. So that is another type of user, regular user. Another user we have in Linux is the root user or the super user. And the root user has the ability to override any file permission or restrictions in the system and can do anything on the system. That is the root user. So those are the three types of users we have in Linux. We have talked about files and their and how they can and how you can attribute their ownership to. Another thing we can talk about is user IDs and group IDs. User IDs, in short form, they are represented in Linux as UID, and these UIDs or user IDs are unique identifiers that are used to identify users available in the systems uniquely. It's like an ID number, the way we use ID numbers. You cannot get two people with the same ID number. That's how user IDs are used, or IDs. And in Linux we have a lot of IDs. We have process IDs, user IDs, group IDs, and so on. But in this video we're going to talk about user IDs, and I've said what user IDs are. And then we have group IDs. Group IDs are, or GIDs are unique identifiers, same as UIDs, but they are used to uniquely identify certain groups or groups available in the system. And remember, users, the users available in the system, they belong to certain groups in the system, and how those users can be attributed to, if you want to know which groups has certain users. That's how that's UIDs and GIDs. That's how they are used on the basic form, that is for a beginner. And another thing is the files that are used to store information on these users and groups available in a system. And one of the files is stored on the root path, root directory, the root directory itself, and it's called the etc directory, etc. And the etc password directory is used to store information about all users available on your Linux system. Apart from the etc password directory, we have another directory that's used to store information about certain groups, or all groups available in a system, and that is the etc group directory. And maybe if you can just look at them so that you can see what you're talking about. That is you can just view the contents of the file used to store information about users, and that's it. That's the etc password directory. That is the path stored in the root path, and this file basically stores information about all users in the system. For example, a good example is the root user, the super user, and the root user is at the top. And one way you can interpret this information, because You cannot just look at it and you don't know what it means. It will not make sense to you. So how you can interpret this information? The output from the cat etsy password directory, that is, you want to view the contents of the password directory. It has 6 columns. The first column, this one, the first column stores information or gives you information about the user or the name of the user. The second column gives you information of the password, although the password is not displayed in plain text because of security and privacy reasons. It's just marked as X, but the actual password is stored on the local system, on somewhere in a database for the purpose of logging in and so on. So that is the second column, gives you information about the password. The third column gives you information about the user ID, what we have talked about. So this user ID is used to uniquely identify the root user apart from all other users in the system. And the user ID, you cannot get 2 users with the same user ID because it will create collisions in the system. The fourth column gives you information about the group ID, that is the group ID, and you have said what the GID is. The fifth column, this one, gives you information about the group to which the root user belongs to. So in this case, the root user belongs to the root group. The sixth column, this one, gives you information about the home directory of the root user, that is the root directory. And lastly, the last column, the seventh column, gives you information about the shell that the root user is allowed to run. And this one we are going to talk about. This is our next class. We are going to talk about bash scripting or shell scripting. So that the last column gives you information about the shell that the user is allowed to run, that is the root user. And as for me, I don't know if you can see, sorry for the screen, but that's how you can basically view the information of all users stored in all users available in your system. And the other file we talked about is the file used to store information about groups in a system, and that is the Etsy group file. And it does not have a lot of information, but you can just, for example, if you use the root user again, this one at the top, the root user, the output is pretty simple for the Etsy group directory, the contents stored in it. We have 3 columns. The first column tells you the name of the group, and the second column tells you the password of that group. Maybe if you want to log into that group or join that group or execute any command using permissions given to specific users of that group, because you can group certain users, put them in a certain group and specific permissions, and take another group like that. But you find that the users in those groups have different permissions. That's how you can use these groups. So the second column tells you about the password of that group, and the last column, the third column, gives you the group ID. And as you can see, it's the same as the last one we checked here, the group ID, this one 0. So that's how you can view information on the various groups and users in your Linux system. and that's from a beginner's perspective, not from the system administrator's perspective. And we're also going to cover Linux system administration in deeper. Another thing we are going to talk about is how you can view and understand these file permissions. Apart from getting information about these users and groups, how you can understand these file permissions in Linux. And there is a simple image I prepared here. It just basically gives you an overview of the Linux permissions and how you can view them. So those are the Linux permissions, and one way you can view these permissions is by using the ls command, and we talked about the ls command. And to view the permissions, you use the ls command with the long listing option, that is the L operator, the L argument. And this, if for example you are in a directory and you use the ls command, it will give you a list of all directories and the files in that specific directory and their permissions. And the output of ls is in 6 columns. As you can see, the first column is the mode. The second column gives information about the owner of that file or directory. The third column gives you information about the group owners or group owner of that file or directory. The fourth column gives you information about the file size, the size of that file or directory. The fifth column gives you information about the last date that the file or directory was modified. It acts as a timestamp. And the last column gives you about the name of that file or directory. And that's how you can interpret the output from the lsl command to view these permissions and this ownership and permissions of certain files in the Linux file system structure. Another thing of importance is the permission classes. There are 3 types of permission classes in Linux, and these classes are divided into user permissions, group permissions, and other permissions. And the user permissions are permissions that belong either to the owner of that file or directory, and at most it shows the owner, the user. The permission class of the user permissions, it shows the permissions that the owner of that file or directory has. The group permissions class shows the permissions that the other users that belong to the owner, that belong to the same group as the owner of that file have. Those are the group permissions. The other permissions show the permissions that other users in the system who don't either belong to the same group as the owner of the file, that is the user, the permissions that they get for that specific file or directory. And the permission classes are divided into 3 parts, of which we have said the user permissions, the group permissions, and the other permissions. And the first column here on the permission classes, that tells you the file type. And in Linux, if it is not a directory, you will get a hyphen if it is an ordinary file while using the ls command. If it's an ordinary file, it will output an hyphen in place of D. Where you see a D, it tells you that is a directory. The type of file is a directory, and so on. The permissions follow. It is how you can distinguish between files, ordinary files, and directories from the lsl command. Another thing you should note of importance is the symbolic permissions, or the symbols used to represent the various permissions in Linux. And they are basically three symbols, as you can see. That is R for read, W for write, and X for execute. And the sorry, the read permission, at most gives the user the ability to view the contents of that file or directory. The write permissions give a user or a group the permissions to modify or either delete a file or a directory. The X, or the execute permission, gives a certain user or a group of users, the permissions to execute or run a file in Linux. Those are executable files in Linux. And we said in the file system structure, most commonly these executable files are stored in the user bin directory, that is the root user bin directory, and the root user sbin directory. Those are system binaries. And that's how you can interpret these permission classes, and how you can interpret these symbolic permissions. Maybe just to, if you can just give you an overview of just a sample of these permissions you have talked about. You have said you can use the ls command, lsl. The ls is used to list the contents of a directory. So the contents of a directory, you can view the permissions from the terminal. And we have said that the first column, if it's an hyphen, it shows you that's a file, an ordinary file apart from the directory, like you can see from the D1. And the permission classes are divided into three classes. One, it shows you the permissions of the user, the current user. And the current user here has the ability to read and write only. The middle one, it gives you the permissions of the group. And the last one gives you the permissions of the other users in the system. That is how you can view the permissions using the lsl command. And apart from that, we have viewed certain user types. We have viewed how you can interpret the output from the etc password directory and the group directory, which has information about the users and groups in the system. In our next lesson, we are going to look at the commands used to create new users, new groups, and how you can manage the permissions of these directories and files. And hope that was enough, but don't fail to catch us in the next class. Thank you.